May 13, 1943, Chicago, Illinois, Navy Pier. Commander Robert T. Nelson stood on the wind-swept pier, watching the strangest vessel he'd seen in 22 years of naval service churn through the gray waters of Lake Michigan toward him. This cannot be what High Command means by an aircraft carrier. The ship approaching was approximately 535 feet long, with a flat steel flight deck rising barely 20 feet above the waterline. But that wasn't what made Nelson stare. Protruding from both sides of the hull, clearly visible even at a distance, were massive wooden housings covering paddle wheels. Coal smoke belched from 4 stacks behind a compact island superstructure on the starboard side. The vessel looked like something from a Mark Twain novel colliding with the modern age of naval warfare. USS Sable, hull designation IX-81. A commissioned warship of the United States Navy that would never see an ocean, never fire a shot in anger, and never face an enemy vessel. Yet within 9 hours of her arrival at Navy Pier that afternoon, 59 pilots became carrier qualified, each completing 8 takeoffs and landings on her 550-foot flight deck. The Sable was joining her sister ship, USS Wolverine, which had been operating from this same pier since January 1943. Together, these 2 paddle-wheel steamers would form what sailors would casually call the Corn Belt Fleet, America's freshwater navy. And over the next 2.5 years, they would train more carrier pilots than any combat carrier in the fleet. Nelson examined the specifications sheet he'd been handed. The Sable had been built in 1924 as the luxury cruise liner Greater Buffalo, designed to carry 2,120 passengers in splendor across Lake Erie. She weighed 8,000 tons at full displacement. Her 4 coal-fired boilers generated 10,500 indicated horsepower, pushing her to a maximum speed of 18 knots. The flight deck was exactly 2/3 the length of the fleet carriers preparing to enter service in the Pacific, the new Essex-class ships that were being commissioned at a rate of 1 every 2 months. What High Command had done was both desperate and brilliant. By May 1943, the U.S. Navy's carrier fleet was expanding at an unprecedented rate. But every carrier pilot needed to qualify for carrier operations, to prove they could land a fast-moving aircraft on a pitching, rolling deck barely wider than their wingspan. Training those pilots on the coasts meant exposing training carriers to German U-boats prowling the Atlantic seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico. The Navy had lost combat carriers at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomon Islands. It couldn't afford to lose training vessels to submarines. The solution had emerged from a proposal initially dismissed as impractical: convert Great Lakes passenger steamers into floating runways and conduct all carrier qualification training in the submarine-free waters of Lake Michigan. The concept had been championed by Commander Richard F. Whitehead, aviation aide at the Great Lakes Training Center at Glenview Naval Air Station north of Chicago, who'd first proposed the idea in early 1941. The Bureau of Ships had ignored him. After Pearl Harbor, the idea landed on the desk of Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest J. King, who approved it immediately. Now Nelson watched the Sable's approach and understood what Washington had created: not a combat weapon, but a training machine, a steel forge for mass-producing the single most valuable commodity in the Pacific War: carrier-qualified naval aviators capable of landing Hellcats and Dauntlesses on the decks of the Essex-class ships that would decide the war's outcome. The journey to this remarkable solution had begun on March 2, 1942. At a cost of $756,000, the Navy requisitioned the passenger ship C&B from the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company. She was 500 feet long, displaced 7,200 tons, and had been built in 1913 by the American Shipbuilding Company at Wyandotte, Michigan. For 3 decades, she'd transported passengers in luxury between Cleveland and Buffalo, earning a reputation as one of the most opulent steamers on the Great Lakes. The C&B was towed to the Erie plant of American Shipbuilding Company in Buffalo, New York, where workers stripped away her Victorian splendor. Cabins were gutted. Passenger decks were removed. The superstructure was demolished down to the main deck. In their place, shipyard workers installed a 550-foot flight deck constructed of oak planks, the same material then used on combat carriers. 8 sets of arresting gear were installed aft. A small island superstructure was built on the starboard side to house the bridge and flight control operations. No hangar deck was installed, no elevators, no catapults, no armor plating, no weapons. On August 2, 1942, the name USS Wolverine was approved. The ship was commissioned on August 12, 1942 at Buffalo with a ceremony closed to the public and attended only by certain dignitaries, the new crew, and approximately 500 workmen still completing final installations. The ship received her name because Michigan was known as the Wolverine State. She was designated IX-64, an unclassified miscellaneous auxiliary vessel, not a combat carrier. The Wolverine departed Buffalo and steamed through the Detroit River, across Lake St. Clair, up the St. Clair River, across Lake Huron, and down the length of Lake Michigan to Chicago. She arrived in January 1943 and was assigned to Navy Pier as part of the 9th Naval District Carrier Qualification Training Unit. The first aircraft landing on USS Wolverine occurred in September 1942 during her shakedown operations. By early 1943, she was conducting flight operations 7 days a week, steaming out of Chicago into the open waters of Lake Michigan, where pilots from Naval Air Station Glenview would practice the most dangerous maneuver in naval aviation, the carrier landing. The mathematics of carrier qualification were brutally simple. A pilot approached the carrier's stern at approximately 80 knots. The carrier steamed forward at 18 knots, creating relative wind over the deck. The pilot had to judge his altitude, airspeed, angle of attack, and position relative to the deck, while compensating for the ship's motion and Lake Michigan's unpredictable winds. He had to catch one of 8 arresting wires with his tail hook. If he missed all 8 wires, a bolter, he had to apply full power immediately and attempt another approach. If he came in too low, he'd hit the stern, the ramp strike, that killed more carrier pilots than enemy fire. If he came in too high or too fast, he'd crash into the barrier or go over the bow. On the Wolverine's first full day of operations in January 1943, pilots from Glenview completed dozens of successful traps and launches. By May 7, 1943, the 7,000th successful landing had been logged on the Wolverine's deck. But the Navy's appetite for carrier pilots was insatiable. The Essex-class carriers were sliding down shipways at an accelerating pace. USS Essex herself had been commissioned on December 31, 1942. USS Lexington followed in February 1943, USS Yorktown in April, USS Bunker Hill in May. Each carrier required approximately 90 aircraft and their pilots. Each pilot needed to complete carrier qualification. The Wolverine couldn't keep pace with demand. On August 7, 1942, the Navy requisitioned a second Great Lakes steamer, the Greater Buffalo. Built in 1924 at a cost of $3.5 million, she was slightly larger than the C&B, 530 feet long with a displacement of 8,000 tons. She could accommodate 2,120 passengers and carry 1,000 tons of freight. In her heyday, she'd been nicknamed the Majestic of the Great Lakes for her opulence and comfort. The Depression had left her docked as a floating hotel. The Greater Buffalo underwent conversion at the same Buffalo shipyard. This time, the Navy specified a steel flight deck instead of wooden planks, making the USS Sable the first American aircraft carrier with a steel deck. The island was more elaborate, with a covered bridge. 2 outriggers were installed forward of the island to accommodate parked aircraft. YE and YG aircraft homing beacons were fitted. She was commissioned on May 8, 1943, and arrived at Navy Pier on May 26, 1943. With 2 carriers now operational, the tempo of training increased dramatically. The Wolverine and Sable operated simultaneously, conducting qualification flights from sunrise until either sunset or fog made operations too dangerous. When operating at full capacity, the two carriers could qualify 100 pilots per day. The Great Lakes training program rapidly established its effectiveness across the expanding American carrier fleet. By summer 1943, Naval Air Station Glenview had become the primary carrier qualification facility for the entire United States Navy. Pilots arrived at Glenview after completing operational flight training at bases across the country. They flew SNJ Texans, Navy variants of the AT-6 trainer. They flew Grumman F-4F Wildcats and the newer F-6F Hellcats. They flew Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers. They flew Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Each pilot's qualification requirement was standardized: 8 successful arrested landings and takeoffs. Later in the war, the requirement was reduced to 8 total traps, but the standard remained rigorous. Pilots kept their cockpits open during all approaches, a safety requirement ensuring they could bail out quickly in the event of a crash. The landing signal officers stationed on the Sable and Wolverine's flight decks guided each approach with standardized paddle signals, identical to those used on fleet carriers in the Pacific. The training cycle operated with industrial efficiency. Pilots would fly from Glenview to rendezvous with whichever carrier was conducting operations that day. The Wolverine or Sable would be steaming north from Chicago, approximately 10 to 15 miles offshore, creating maximum sea room for flight operations. Pilots would enter the landing pattern, make their approach, trap aboard, taxi forward to the bow, receive the signal to launch, roll down the short deck, and lift off. They'd climb back into the pattern and do it again, and again, 8 times. Then they'd return to Glenview, carrier qualified. The impact on the Pacific War was immediate and measurable. In August 1943, USS Essex and USS Yorktown arrived in Hawaii, the first of the new generation to enter combat operations. Their air groups were composed entirely of pilots who'd qualified on the Wolverine and Sable. In November 1943, Essex led Task Group 50.3 in the assault on the Gilbert Islands, launching attacks against Tarawa. The pilots making those strikes had learned to land on a carrier deck within sight of the Chicago skyline. The pattern repeated across 1943 and 1944. USS Intrepid commissioned in August 1943, USS Hornet in November, USS Wasp in November. USS Bunker Hill had arrived in the Pacific Theater in May 1943. Each new Essex-class carrier required trained air groups. The Wolverine and Sable delivered them in a continuous stream. By the end of 1943, the contribution of Essex-class carriers had irreversibly tipped the balance of Pacific air power in America's favor. The recapture of the Gilbert Islands marked the beginning. The Marshall Islands followed in early 1944, then the Marianas, then the Philippines. And behind every one of those operations stood the strange paddlewheel carriers on Lake Michigan, churning through cold fresh water, launching and recovering aircraft at a rate that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The training carriers operated in all weather conditions, unless conditions became genuinely dangerous: snow, rain, summer heat that reached into the 90s, winter cold that made open cockpit flying an ordeal pilots remembered for the rest of their lives. Future President George H.W. Bush qualified on USS Sable as a 20-year-old lieutenant junior grade. He later recalled the experience vividly, particularly the winter flights. The Sable and Wolverine had no heated ready rooms, no comfortable quarters. Pilots sat in cramped spaces below deck between flights, and when their turn came, they climbed into open cockpits and flew into wind that felt like knives at 5,000 feet over Lake Michigan in January. The training was authentic because it had to be. The Wolverine and Sable presented pilots with challenges more difficult than they'd face on fleet carriers. The flight decks were 550 feet long, approximately 250 feet shorter than a fleet carrier. The decks were closer to the water, meaning less margin for error on approach. The carriers had no catapults, meaning pilots had to generate all their takeoff speed from their engines and the wind over deck. And Lake Michigan, despite Chicago's reputation as the windy city, often had insufficient wind for safe operations. This became the program's most persistent challenge. Wind over deck, the combination of the ship's forward speed and natural wind, needed to reach specific minimums for different aircraft types. The Sable and Wolverine could make 18 knots maximum. On calm days, the air over Lake Michigan was simply too still. Heavy frontline combat aircraft like F-6F Hellcats, F-4U Corsairs, and TBF Avengers sometimes couldn't generate sufficient lift for safe recoveries. Even the lighter SNJ Texans occasionally struggled. On completely calm days, flight operations had to be suspended altogether, sometimes for days at a time. But when conditions permitted, the training machine operated at peak efficiency. The Wolverine and Sable would leave Navy Pier in the morning, steam to their operating areas, launch and recover aircraft continuously throughout the day, and return to the pier before dark. Neither ship was configured for overnight aircraft storage. Planes would be flown back to Glenview, the carriers would dock. The next morning, the cycle would repeat. The effectiveness of the freshwater training program wasn't immediately obvious to outside observers. But by mid-1943, the statistical evidence became undeniable. The Wolverine and Sable weren't just training pilots, they were training them at a scale and efficiency that matched the industrial output of American shipyards. In August 1943, USS Essex and USS Yorktown joined the Pacific Fleet. These were the first two Essex-class carriers to enter combat operations, and they represented a quantum leap in American naval aviation capability. Essex displaced 36,380 tons fully loaded, one-third larger than the pre-war Yorktown-class carriers. She could carry 90 to 100 aircraft. She featured an integrated combat information center with advanced radar systems providing 360-degree coverage from sea level to 30,000 feet. She had 4-channel VHF radios giving task force fighter directors unprecedented control over combat air patrols. But all that technology meant nothing without trained pilots. And every pilot aboard Essex and Yorktown had qualified on the decks of the Wolverine or Sable. The training pipeline's importance became critical in late 1943 when the Essex-class production rate accelerated. Between December 1942 and December 1944, the United States Navy commissioned 18 Essex-class carriers, averaging one every 6 to 8 weeks. Construction time from keel laying to commissioning had been reduced to 16 to 20 months, compared to the 3 to 4 years required for pre-war carriers like Yorktown and Enterprise. This industrial achievement was unmatched in naval history. But rapid carrier production created a corresponding demand. Each new carrier needed air groups. The Navy needed thousands of carrier-qualified pilots, and it needed them immediately. Training those pilots on active fleet carriers was impossible. Every combat carrier was needed in the Pacific. Training them on the Atlantic coast exposed training vessels to German submarines. The U-boat threat along the eastern seaboard remained serious throughout 1943. Training carriers had been sunk by submarines in other navies. The risk was unacceptable. The Wolverine and Sable solved this problem definitively. Lake Michigan offered submarine-free waters with adequate sea room for carrier operations. Chicago's industrial infrastructure supported maintenance and logistics. Naval Air Station Glenview provided the pilot training pipeline and aircraft. And the 2 paddlewheel carriers provided the floating decks where theory transformed into muscle memory. The human cost of this training, remarkably, was minimal. Of the approximately 120,000 total landings conducted on the Wolverine and Sable between 1942 and 1945, there were just over 200 accidents. Approximately 120 aircraft ditched or crashed into Lake Michigan, most recoverable, many not. But only 8 pilots were killed during the entire 3-year training program. This safety record was exceptional, particularly considering the inherently dangerous nature of carrier operations. The low casualty rate reflected several factors. Lake Michigan's relatively calm waters provided more forgiving conditions than the open ocean. The carrier's low freeboard meant pilots who crashed near the deck were closer to potential rescue. The training program operated in conditions that, while challenging, avoided the extreme dangers of combat operations. No enemy fire, no battle damage, no operations at night. But the training itself was ruthlessly realistic. Pilots who couldn't master carrier landings in the controlled environment of Lake Michigan wouldn't be sent to fleet carriers in the Pacific. The program's standards remained high precisely because lives depended on them. Every pilot who trapped aboard the Wolverine and Sable learned the same lesson. Carrier aviation demanded precision, judgment, and nerve. The landing signal officer's paddles gave you guidance, but the landing was yours alone. You either caught a wire or you boltered. You either maintained proper airspeed or you ramp struck. There was no room for error, and Lake Michigan taught that lesson with unforgiving clarity. Lieutenant Commander Herbert N. Houck, commanding officer of Fighting Squadron 9, trained on the carriers and later wrote about the experience. His squadron's scoreboard included victories against Vichy French planes in Operation Torch and against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. Every pilot in that squadron had qualified on the Wolverine or Sable first. The freshwater training had prepared them for the real thing. The carrier's physical limitations actually enhanced training effectiveness. The 550-foot flight deck was deliberately shorter than fleet carriers, forcing pilots to develop precision and discipline. Landing on a fleet carrier after qualifying on the Wolverine felt easier, exactly as intended. The absence of catapults meant pilots had to master the skills of deck takeoffs using only engine power and wind. The low freeboard kept pilots constantly aware of their altitude and approach. Every challenge on Lake Michigan translated to capability in the Pacific. By early 1944, the pattern was established and undeniable. The Essex-class carriers operating in the Pacific, Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, Hornet, Hancock, Ticonderoga, and Bennington, all depended on air groups trained on the Wolverine and Sable. These carriers formed Task Force 58, the most powerful carrier striking force ever assembled. In February 1944, TF-58 launched massive attacks against Truk, the Japanese stronghold in the Caroline Islands, sinking 8 ships and destroying hundreds of aircraft. The pilots conducting those strikes had learned their trade on Lake Michigan. The freshwater carriers had become the invisible foundation of American naval dominance in the Pacific. While Essex-class carriers received headlines and battle stars, while their pilots earned Navy crosses and distinguished flying crosses, while their operations determined the course of the war, the Wolverine and Sable churned quietly through Lake Michigan, training the next wave of pilots who would crew those carriers and win those battles. The conversion of luxury passenger steamers into aircraft carriers represented a design philosophy fundamentally different from traditional warship construction. Commander Richard F. Whitehead's original 1941 proposal had recognized a critical insight. Carrier qualification training didn't require a combat-capable warship. It required only a floating deck of adequate size, moving at adequate speed, in safe waters. The requirements that shaped the Wolverine and Sable were straightforward and specific. The Navy needed flight decks long enough to accommodate fleet aircraft types, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The decks needed to be wide enough for safe landing approaches. The ships needed sufficient speed to generate adequate wind over deck for aircraft operations. They needed to accommodate flight deck crews, landing signal officers, and support personnel. They needed to operate continuously in Great Lakes conditions. And they needed to be produced quickly and cheaply enough to be economically viable. The C&B and Greater Buffalo met these requirements almost perfectly. Both were large passenger steamers with substantial hulls and powerful engines. Both were readily available. The Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company had gone bankrupt in 1939, and the Depression had ended their profitable operations. Both could be acquired cheaply and converted relatively quickly. Both were coal-fired rather than oil-fired, which initially seemed like a disadvantage but proved workable. Coal was readily available in Chicago and the Great Lakes region. The conversion design eliminated everything unnecessary for the training mission. No hangar deck. All aircraft would be maintained ashore at Glenview. No elevators. Aircraft would fly to and from the carriers, but never be stored aboard. No catapults. Pilots would launch using only engine power and wind over deck, exactly as they would during combat carrier operations when catapults were unavailable or inoperative. No armor. The ships would never face enemy fire. No weapons. They would never engage enemy forces. This ruthless minimalism kept conversion cost low and construction time short. The Wolverine's conversion cost $756,000 and took approximately 5 months from acquisition to commissioning. The Sable's conversion was slightly more expensive, but similarly quick. Compare this to fleet carrier construction. Essex-class carriers cost approximately $78 million each and required 16 to 20 months to build, even with wartime acceleration. The design choice to retain paddlewheel propulsion initially drew skepticism. Paddlewheels seemed antiquated, inefficient, and incompatible with modern naval operations. But the decision proved sound. Paddlewheel propulsion was already installed and functional. Converting to screw propellers would have required extensive hull modifications, adding time and cost. The paddle wheels provided adequate speed, 18 knots maximum, sufficient for carrier operations. And they were mechanically simple enough that crew training was straightforward. The coal-fired boilers similarly seemed archaic in an era when the Navy's fleet ran on fuel oil. But coal power had advantages in the Great Lakes context. Coal was readily available from Midwest sources. The infrastructure for coal handling existed at Great Lakes ports. And the visible coal smoke, while messy and unglamorous, was inconsequential for training operations. Fleet carriers at sea needed to minimize smoke for tactical reasons. Training carriers on Lake Michigan had no such constraint. The most critical design element was the flight deck itself. The Wolverine received a 550-foot wooden flight deck constructed of oak planks, identical material to combat carriers of the era. The Sable received a 550-foot steel deck, the first steel deck on any American carrier. Both decks were equipped with 8 sets of arresting gear aft, providing standard carrier landing configuration. Both had painted deck markings matching fleet carrier standards. Both had island superstructures on the starboard side, with flight control facilities and bridge. The 550-foot length was deliberate. Fleet carriers of the Essex-class had flight decks approximately 800 feet long. By making the training carriers' decks significantly shorter, the Navy ensured that pilots who could land on the Wolverine or Sable would find fleet carrier decks relatively easy. The principle was simple: train hard, fight easy. Make qualification more difficult than combat operations, and combat operations become survivable. The low freeboard, the height from waterline to flight deck, similarly increased training difficulty. The Wolverine and Sable's decks sat barely 20 feet above the water, substantially lower than fleet carriers. This meant pilots had less vertical margin for error on approach. Coming in too low resulted in immediate consequences.
The low freeboard kept pilots constantly aware of altitude and glide path, precisely the awareness they'd need on fleet carriers where the consequences of mistakes were far more severe. The decision to operate without catapults forced pilots to master deck launches under challenging conditions. Most fleet carriers had catapults, but catapults weren't always available. They required maintenance, they could malfunction, and combat damage could disable them. Pilots who'd trained on the Wolverine and Sable could launch without catapult assistance, giving them operational flexibility in the fleet. The design philosophy underlying these choices reflected American industrial pragmatism. Identify the minimum requirements for mission success, eliminate everything unnecessary, use available resources efficiently, and accept inelegance if it achieves results quickly and cheaply. The Wolverine and Sable weren't beautiful ships. They weren't impressive or modern or photogenic. Coal smoke billowed from their stacks. Paddle wheels churned awkwardly on their sides. They looked like historical curiosities mistakenly painted in navy gray. But they worked. They worked at scale. They worked reliably. And they worked at exactly the moment when the United States Navy needed them the most, when the industrial mobilization of 1942-1943 was producing fleet carriers faster than the training system could produce pilots to fly from them. The paddle wheel carriers on Lake Michigan solved that bottleneck definitively.
The operational impact of the Wolverine and Sable became fully visible in the Pacific campaigns of 1944 and 1945. Every major carrier operation during this period depended on pilots trained in the freshwater Navy. February 17 to 18, 1944, Task Force 58 launched Operation Hailstone against Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands. The Japanese had fortified Truk as their primary forward base in the Central Pacific, the Gibraltar of the Pacific. TF-58 assembled the most powerful carrier striking force yet deployed: USS Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, and several light carriers. Over 2 days, American carrier aircraft flew more than 1,200 sorties, sinking 8 warships, 32 merchant vessels, and destroying 275 aircraft. Truk was neutralized as an operational base. The pilots conducting those strikes had qualified on Lake Michigan. June 19 to 20, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated American air superiority at its most overwhelming. Task Force 58 had grown to 15 carriers, including 7 Essex-class ships. Japanese forces launched massive raids attempting to destroy the American fleet. American F-6F Hellcats intercepted them systematically. Over 2 days, the Japanese lost approximately 600 aircraft and 3 carriers. American losses totaled 123 aircraft, primarily from operational accidents during night recoveries. The pilots who achieved this victory had learned carrier operations on the Wolverine and Sable. October 24 to 25, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, saw Essex-class carriers playing decisive roles in multiple actions. USS Essex herself was part of Task Group 38.4, engaging Japanese surface forces. The pilot proficiency demonstrated during Leyte Gulf reflected training standardization across the fleet. Landing signal officers, deck crews, and pilots all operated with procedures learned and practiced first on Lake Michigan. The human statistics behind these operations were staggering. Between January 1943 and November 1945, the Wolverine and Sable conducted approximately 120,000 arrested landings. Sources vary slightly on the exact pilot count. Some cite 17,000, others 17,820, still others mention 18,000.
Records indicate that approximately 17,820 pilots completed carrier qualification on the two ships. In addition, landing signal officers received training, approximately 200 total. Deck crews rotated through for familiarization training. The total personnel who received some form of carrier operations training on the freshwater carriers exceeded 35,000. The training tempo at peak operations was relentless. Work began at sunrise. The Wolverine or Sable would depart Navy Pier, steam to their operating area approximately 10 to 15 miles offshore, and commence flight operations. Aircraft from Glenview would fly out in groups. Landing cycles would continue throughout the day. 8 traps per pilot, multiple pilots per aircraft, continuous operations. When operating at full capacity, the two carriers could process 100 pilot qualifications per day. At sunset or when fog reduced visibility below safe minimums, operations would cease. The carriers would return to Navy Pier. The cycle would repeat the next day. Steaming at full speed for a 14-hour training period, each carrier consumed approximately 150 tons of coal. The coal smoke was prodigious, black plumes trailing from 4 stacks, visible for miles. Contemporary photographs show the carriers wreathed in smoke, looking more like industrial vessels than warships. The smoke bothered nobody. What mattered was the training output. The accident rate remained remarkably low throughout the program. Of the 200-plus accidents, most involved aircraft damage without pilot casualties. Aircraft that crashed or ditched into Lake Michigan often sank in deep water. The cold fresh water preserved them remarkably well. Post-war surveys estimated that 135 to 300 aircraft remain on the lake bottom, a unique underwater museum of World War II naval aviation. By 2024, 35 aircraft had been recovered and either restored or preserved. Salvage operations continue, as each recovered aircraft represents a rare historical artifact preserved in near-perfect condition by the lake's cold, fresh water. The 8 pilot fatalities during 3 years of intensive operations reflected a safety record unmatched by any comparable training program. This reflected careful operational procedures, experienced landing signal officers, adequate safety boats stationed during all operations, and the relatively forgiving conditions of Lake Michigan compared to open ocean. But it also reflected the quality of the pilots entering the program. They'd already completed extensive flight training before reaching Glenview. The contrast with fleet carrier operations was stark. Fleet carriers in combat faced kamikazes, bombs, torpedoes, typhoons, and the constant dangers of sustained high-tempo operations. USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs off Okinawa on March 19, 1945. The bombs penetrated the flight deck, exploding among armed and fueled aircraft on the hangar deck. The resulting fires and explosions killed 724 men and wounded 265. Franklin survived, testament to Essex-class construction, but the casualties exceeded all pilot fatalities from the entire Wolverine and Sable program combined. Yet Franklin's pilots had learned their carrier skills on Lake Michigan. The deck crews who fought Franklin's fires had trained at Glenview and aboard the paddlewheel carriers. The landing signal officers who'd guided countless aircraft aboard Franklin's deck had qualified on the Wolverine or Sable first. The freshwater training had prepared them for the worst day in American carrier history. Across the Pacific theater, the pattern repeated. USS Bunker Hill was hit by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945, off Okinawa, killing 396 men. USS Intrepid survived 4 separate kamikaze hits during the war. USS Essex herself was hit by a kamikaze on November 25, 1944, off the Philippines. In each case, the ship survived and continued operations. In each case, the pilots and crews who saved those ships had been trained on the Wolverine and Sable. The operational philosophy of the freshwater carriers proved its value not in dramatic combat achievements, they never saw combat, but in the steady industrial-scale production of combat-ready pilots. The training system operated like a factory, taking raw materials, pilots with basic flight training, and producing finished products, carrier-qualified naval aviators. The efficiency and reliability of this system enabled the carrier war in the Pacific to be sustained at intensity levels the Japanese couldn't match. By late 1944, Japan's carrier pilot training program had collapsed. Losses of trained aviators during 1942 to 1943 had never been replaced. The Japanese training system couldn't produce pilots at the rate American carriers destroyed them. Meanwhile, American carriers appeared in growing numbers, each crewed by pilots fresh from Glenview and Lake Michigan. The arithmetic was inexorable. American pilot quality improved, Japanese pilot quality declined. The outcome became inevitable. The Wolverine and Sable weren't the cause of Japanese defeat, but they were essential enablers of American victory. They transformed carrier pilot production from a bottleneck into a flood. They allowed the Essex-class carriers to operate at full capacity immediately upon commissioning rather than waiting months for air groups to qualify. They created a training standardization that ensured every pilot in the fleet had experienced identical qualification procedures. And they did all this while operating in complete safety from enemy action, in waters that never saw a submarine or an enemy aircraft.
The complete statistical record of the Wolverine and Sable training program documents one of the most successful specialized operations of World War II. Between August 1942 and November 1945, the two carriers operated continuously from Navy Pier in Chicago. USS Wolverine logged 31 months of active service. USS Sable logged 30 months. Together, they conducted over 120,000 arrested landings. USS Wolverine specifications: 7,200 tons displacement, 500 feet overall length, 98 feet beam, including paddlewheel housings, 15 feet 6 inches draft, 4 coal-fired boilers generating 8,000 indicated horsepower through inclined compound engines, maximum speed 18 knots. Flight deck, 550 feet long, constructed of oak planking, 8 arresting gear installations. Crew, approximately 270 officers and enlisted. Commissioned August 12, 1942. Decommissioned November 7, 1945. USS Sable specifications: 8,000 tons displacement, 535 feet 5 inches overall length, 92 feet 2 inches beam, 15 feet 6 inches draft. 4 coal-fired boilers generating 10,500 indicated horsepower through inclined compound engines. Maximum speed 18 knots. Flight deck 550 feet long. Steel construction, first steel flight deck in U.S. Navy. 8 arresting gear installations, 2 outriggers forward of island for aircraft parking. Crew, approximately 270 officers and enlisted. Commissioned May 8, 1943, decommissioned November 7, 1945. Both carriers were decommissioned on the same day, November 7, 1945, 3 months after Japan's surrender. Both were struck from the Naval Vessel Register on November 28, 1945. The Wolverine was transferred to the Warshipping Administration on November 26, 1947, and sold for scrap on November 21, 1947. The Sable was sold to H. Bunter Company on July 7, 1948, and scrapped on July 27, 1948. Neither ship received significant recognition during their service. They earned the American Campaign Medal and the World War II Victory Medal, standard awards for vessels serving during the war period. They received no battle stars. They'd seen no combat. They appeared in few contemporary photographs compared to fleet carriers. Newspaper coverage of their operations was minimal. The Navy treated them as useful auxiliary vessels, but not as significant combatants worthy of sustained attention. The pilot training output told a different story.
Records indicate that 17,820 pilots completed carrier qualification on the Wolverine and Sable. Additionally, approximately 200 landing signal officers received training. Over 35,000 total personnel received some form of carrier operations training aboard the two ships. These numbers represented approximately 60% of all carrier pilots trained during World War II. The aircraft types operated from the carriers included virtually every Navy aircraft in the inventory. SNJ Texan trainers, the most common. F-4F Wildcats, the frontline fighter at the program's start. F-6F Hellcats, the aircraft that dominated the Pacific War. F-4U Corsairs, initially considered too difficult for carrier operations but eventually mastered. SBD Dauntless dive bombers, the aircraft that sank 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, the type George H.W. Bush flew in combat. Each aircraft type had different handling characteristics, different stall speeds, different landing approach procedures. The Wolverine and Sable accommodated them all. The accident record showed 200-plus incidents across 3 years. Of these, approximately 120 aircraft were lost, crashed, or ditched into Lake Michigan. 8 pilots were killed. The fatality rate was approximately 0.045%, 1 death per 2,227 pilots trained. This compared favorably to virtually every other military aviation training program of the era. The comparative analysis with fleet carrier operations revealed stark contrasts. Essex-class carriers had flight decks approximately 800 feet long, 250 feet longer than the Wolverine and Sable. Essex carriers displaced 36,380 tons fully loaded, approximately 5 times the displacement of the training carriers. Essex carriers had catapults capable of launching fully loaded bombers. They had hangar decks, elevators, extensive aviation fuel storage, ammunition magazines, radar systems, combat information centers, and comprehensive defensive armament. But for the single specific purpose of teaching pilots how to land on a moving deck, the most critical and dangerous skill in carrier aviation, the Wolverine and Sable proved entirely adequate. Pilots who could land on a 550-foot deck found an 800-foot deck manageable. Pilots who could launch without catapults could certainly launch with them. Pilots who'd trained in Lake Michigan's unpredictable winds could handle Pacific weather. The training environment's difficulty translated directly to combat capability. The American approach to pilot training reflected a broader strategic philosophy: invest resources in training and safety to preserve experienced personnel. Japanese training doctrine took the opposite approach: produce pilots quickly, accept high training casualties, prioritize aggressive tactics over survivability. American pilots who survived their first few combat missions gained experience that made them increasingly effective. Japanese pilots who survived had minimal rotation back to training duties. Experienced pilots remained in combat until killed or wounded. This philosophical difference showed in training facilities. The Wolverine and Sable represented significant resource investment for a specialized purpose. Japan's carrier training program never developed equivalent facilities. Japanese pilots qualified on active fleet carriers, which meant training competed with operational requirements. When Japanese carriers were sunk, 4 at Midway, 4 during the Solomon Islands campaign, the training capacity was destroyed along with the combat capability. The statistical outcome was decisive. By 1944, the average American carrier pilot had substantially more training hours than his Japanese counterpart. American pilots who survived their initial combat exposure became squadron leaders, passing expertise to newer pilots. Japanese pilots' quality declined continuously throughout the war. The training gap, widened by facilities like the Wolverine and Sable, proved as important as industrial production in determining the war's outcome.
November 7, 1945, Navy Pier, Chicago. Commander Robert T. Nelson watched the same 2 carriers he'd been training pilots on for 2.5 years slide quietly to the pier for the final time. The war had ended 3 months earlier. Japan had surrendered on August 15th. The flood of pilots needing carrier qualification had stopped overnight.
The USS Wolverine and USS Sable had served their purpose. Their decommissioning received no ceremony, no press coverage, no official recognition of their contribution. The crew members were discharged and sent home. The ships were stripped of their naval equipment and prepared for disposal. Within 3 years, both would be scrapped. But the legacy was written across the Pacific. The Essex-class carriers that had destroyed Japanese naval aviation and recaptured the Pacific, Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hancock, Bennington, Ticonderoga, and others, had all depended on pilots trained on Lake Michigan. The 17,820 pilots who'd earned their carrier qualifications on the paddlewheel steamers had flown the missions that mattered. They'd struck Truk, fought the Philippine Sea, covered the landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and conducted strikes against the Japanese home islands. The irony was profound and complete. To achieve dominance on the world's largest ocean, the Pacific, covering 63 million square miles, the United States Navy had built its pilot training system around a landlocked freshwater lake. The ships that won the carrier war had never touched salt water. The decks where America's naval aviators learned their trade were powered by paddle wheels and coal smoke, technologies from the 19th century serving a 20th century war. The Wolverine and Sable represented American industrial creativity and logistical dominance at its finest. Faced with an urgent requirement and dangerous constraints, trained thousands of pilots without exposing training carriers to submarine attack, the Navy had found an elegant solution: use what's available, adapt it efficiently, operate it relentlessly, and achieve the mission. The solution wasn't glamorous or photogenic. It was practical, efficient, and it worked. The lesson extended beyond carrier aviation. The paddlewheel carriers demonstrated a principle that applied across America's war effort. Victory depended not just on producing superior weapons, but on training superior personnel to employ those weapons. The Essex-class carriers were magnificent ships, but they required skilled pilots to be effective. Producing those pilots at scale, with standardization and safety, proved as important as producing the carriers themselves. The freshwater Navy also revealed the importance of safe training environments. The 8 pilot fatalities across 120,000 landings showed what careful operational procedures, experienced instructors, and controlled conditions could achieve. Japanese pilot training, conducted under operational pressure on active carriers, suffered far higher casualty rates. The American willingness to invest resources in training infrastructure, even strange infrastructure, like paddlewheel carriers, paid strategic dividends. The ultimate judgment on the USS Wolverine and USS Sable must acknowledge what they were and what they accomplished. They were not combat vessels. They never engaged enemy forces. They never fired weapons in anger. They never earned battle stars or unit citations. They operated in safety while fleet carriers fought and died in the Pacific. But they trained the pilots who won the war. Every carrier pilot flying from Essex-class decks in 1944 and 1945 had learned their trade on Lake Michigan. Every landing signal officer guiding aircraft aboard fleet carriers had qualified on the Wolverine or Sable. Every deck crew working under fire had practiced their procedures on the paddlewheel carriers. The training was authentic, rigorous, and effective, precisely because it prioritized mission requirements over appearance. The examination of the Wolverine and Sable after the war revealed vessels that had served their purpose completely. They'd conducted 120,000 arrested landings. They'd trained 17,820 pilots. They'd operated continuously for 3 years in all weather conditions Lake Michigan offered. They'd achieved a safety record unmatched by comparable training programs. And they'd done all this while looking utterly absurd. Paddle wheels turning, coal smoke billowing, wooden and steel decks bolted onto passenger steamer hulls, operating in fresh water within sight of downtown Chicago. The USS Wolverine and USS Sable were not poorly conceived. They were brilliantly conceived to achieve a specific goal: mass-produce carrier-qualified pilots in the shortest time possible, at the lowest cost possible, with the highest safety possible, in waters completely secure from enemy action. Those goals did not include aesthetic appeal, combat capability, or operational flexibility. They required only a floating deck of adequate size moving at adequate speed in safe waters. And in that single fact lies the entire story of how America won the Pacific War. Victory required industrial production, technological innovation, strategic planning, and tactical excellence, but it also required unglamorous, practical solutions to logistical problems. Solutions like converting paddlewheel steamers into carrier aircraft and operating them on a lake. The willingness to embrace such solutions, to prioritize function over form and results over appearance, distinguished American military effectiveness throughout the war. The paddlewheel carriers on Lake Michigan trained the pilots who won the greatest naval victory in history. They were scrapped and forgotten within 3 years of the war's end. But for 30 months, they were the most important aircraft carriers in the United States Navy. And the pilots who learned to land on those short, narrow, coal smoke-wreathed decks within sight of the Chicago skyline went on to dismantle the Japanese Empire one carrier strike at a time. That achievement deserves to be remembered.